The classroom fell into an unnerving silence as the teacher's sharp gaze locked onto Jamal's worn-out shoes. A cruel laugh echoed through the room, cutting through the air like a blade. Jamal shifted uncomfortably, the sting of humiliation searing through him as the other students snickered. The teacher's voice rang out again, dripping with disdain as she mocked the young boy's appearance. But it wasn't just the shoes. It wasn't just the way he looked on the outside. No, it was something much deeper, something darker, that had caught her attention. As she glared at him, Jamal felt a chill crawl down his spine. What had she really seen? And what was hidden inside his backpack that would change everything? The tension was palpable, the eyes of his classmates now shifting nervously between him and the teacher. Jamal had always been the quiet kid, the one who kept his head down, but today, something was different. The world was about to change, not just for him, but for everyone who thought they knew who he was. What they would learn would shake the very foundation of their beliefs. And no one would leave the room the same. The worn-out hallway echoed with the rhythmic clatter of lockers slamming shut and the hurried footsteps of students rushing to their next class. It was the end of the day, and the high school's once vibrant energy had begun to fade, giving way to an air of exhaustion. The sun, already dipping below the horizon, cast long shadows across the narrow corridor, highlighting the faded posters on the walls and the chipped paint of lockers. Everything about the building spoke of time that had passed and left, behind a trail of neglect. But for Jamal, it felt like time had come to a standstill. He moved through the hallways like a ghost, his head down, his sneakers softly squeaking on the worn linoleum floor. At 16, Jamal had already become accustomed to blending in, to staying out of the spotlight. A quiet observer, he rarely spoke unless spoken to, and even then his answers were short, his voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't that he lacked confidence. No, Jamal had plenty of that. But confidence in a world that judged him for the color of his skin, for the worn clothes he wore, and for the way his family struggled. Well, that was something he had yet to come to terms with. His father, a man of few words but strong will, had always told him to hold your head high no matter what the world throws at you. Jamal had tried to take those words to heart, to carry them with him through every day at school. But it wasn't easy when you were constantly reminded that you didn't quite fit in. Whether it was the whispers in the hallway or the stares he caught from classmates, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that he was always just one step away from being completely invisible, or worse, one step away from being seen for something he wasn't. At home, things weren't much different. His mother worked 2 jobs to make ends meet, her tired eyes always searching for a way to make life better for Jamal and his little sister Kendra. Their apartment, small and cramped, was filled with the sound of her constant phone calls, trying to negotiate bills, arrange childcare, and keep the family afloat. Jamal hated seeing his mother stressed, but he knew she was doing the best she could. He didn't want to burden her with his problems. After all, what could he possibly say that would make things better? What could he say that would make the bullying, the judgment, the feeling of being an outsider go away? But Jamal wasn't the only one who felt the weight of his circumstances. He had his friends, Derek, a tall, broad-shouldered athlete who was known for his charisma, and Tasha, who was always there to crack a joke or lend a hand when things got tough. They had all grown up together, their bond formed in the early years of elementary school, when life had seemed so much simpler. Back then, they didn't care about who had the best shoes or the most expensive backpack. But now, in high school, things had changed. As the trio sat together during lunch, the world around them seemed like an entirely different place. Derek, with his wide grin and easy charm, was always the center of attention, while Tasha had become a master at deflecting attention from herself, using her wit to make people laugh. But Jamal often felt like the quiet shadow in the back, the one who was happy to let others take the spotlight. The only time he felt truly alive was when they played basketball after school, the court a place where he could let his frustrations go, if only for a little while. Yet, today, something was different. The usual hum of chatter and laughter in the cafeteria seemed distant, muffled, as Jamal sat at the edge of the table, staring down at his tray. The tension in the air was palpable. His eyes kept flicking toward the teacher's desk in the far corner of the room. Mrs. Harrison, the new English teacher, had been grating on his nerves ever since she first arrived. There was something about her that made him uneasy, something in the way she looked at him with judgment in her eyes, as if she could see right through him. But it wasn't just the way she looked at him. It was the way she looked at everyone who didn't fit her idea of what a perfect student should be. Jamal had overheard her dismissing Derek's essay as unsophisticated last week, and she had made a snide comment about Tasha's lack of focus in class. But it was the day Jamal had forgotten his textbook that had set things off. Mrs. Harrison had glared at him in front of the entire class, her voice laced with mockery. "Forget your book again, Jamal. Maybe you should focus more on your studies instead of—" She had glanced down at his shoes, her lips curling into a smile. "Well, I'm sure those will take you far." The comment had stung, but it was nothing compared to what was coming. Jamal's shoes weren't the problem, and he knew it. They were just a reflection of the reality he faced every day. His family couldn't afford new ones. His sneakers were a hand-me-down from his older cousin, and they were starting to show signs of wear. Frayed laces, the soles barely clinging together. But Jamal didn't mind. They had gotten him this far. He was proud of them, in fact. Every scuff on the toe was a reminder of the miles he had walked, the challenges he had faced. But to Mrs. Harrison, those shoes were a symbol of something else, something lesser. And that day, in front of everyone, she had made sure he knew it. As the final bell rang and students poured out of the classroom, Jamal lingered at his desk, packing up his things slowly, unwilling to leave just yet. His heart was heavy, the weight of the day's humiliation pressing down on him. But as he grabbed his backpack and stood up, something unexpected happened. Mrs. Harrison's voice called out to him, sharp and cold. "Jamal, stay for a moment." He froze. She had that look in her eyes again, the one that made his skin crawl. "Sure, Mrs. Harrison," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. His palms were sweaty as he walked toward her desk, his steps slow, almost reluctant. What was this about now? Was she going to mock him some more? Or worse, give him detention for something he didn't even understand? "Let's see what's in your backpack today, Jamal," she said with a sneer, the words dripping with a sense of superiority. Jamal felt his stomach churn, his body tense. He didn't know what was in his backpack today, just the usual. Some homework, a few old books. But there was something else, something he'd been carrying around for weeks. And for the first time, it felt like it might just change everything. As Mrs. Harrison leaned forward, ready to inspect the contents of his backpack, Jamal's hand hovered over the zipper. He had no idea what would happen next. Jamal's heart raced as Mrs. Harrison's eyes bore into him, her fingers tapping impatiently on the edge of her desk. The classroom had emptied, leaving the two of them alone in the quiet stillness, save for the low hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. His palms were clammy and his throat felt dry, as if every breath was a struggle. "Go on," Mrs. Harrison said, her voice sharp, commanding. "Open it." Jamal hesitated. He had no idea what to expect, but the weight of her gaze was enough to make him feel like he was under a microscope. With a slow, deliberate motion, he unzipped the top of his backpack. Inside, there were the usual things: his worn-out notebook, a few textbooks, a crumpled-up assignment he had almost forgotten to turn in. But there, tucked at the very bottom, was something he hadn't meant to bring to school today. Something he had kept hidden for weeks, waiting for the right moment. A small, unassuming box. Mrs. Harrison's eyes narrowed as she leaned forward, her lips curving into a sly smile. "What's this?" she asked, her voice dripping with curiosity and something else, something darker. Jamal felt his throat tighten. He could feel her eyes on him, dissecting his every move. "It's nothing," he mumbled, instinctively grabbing the box and trying to stuff it back into his bag. But Mrs. Harrison was faster. She reached out and snatched the box from his hands, her fingers curling around it like a vice. She held it up, inspecting it as though it were some kind of treasure. Jamal could see the glint of her smirk growing wider, and something inside him twisted. "What do we have here?" she said, her voice laced with mockery. "A little secret, Jamal." He wanted to run, wanted to escape the suffocating tension that filled the room, but he couldn't. His feet felt rooted to the spot, his body frozen in place. Mrs. Harrison's gaze never left him, her expression one of triumph, as though she had caught him in the act of some grave sin. Jamal's breath hitched as he watched her peel open the lid of the small box. Inside there was a folded piece of paper. He could see the way her eyes scanned the contents, her expression flickering between amusement and something darker, something judgmental. "Go ahead," she said coldly, her voice practically dripping with venom. "Tell me what this is, Jamal." It wasn't just a piece of paper. It was the letter he had written to his father, a letter he had never intended for anyone else to read. His father, who had been absent for the better part of the year, was supposed to be coming home soon. Jamal had spent weeks gathering the courage to write him, telling him everything he had been too afraid to say in person. He had poured his heart into the letter, telling his father how much he missed him, how hard life had been without him, and how much he wished for things to be different. It was raw, emotional, and deeply personal. But now Mrs. Harrison was holding it up for the world to see. "Why would you keep something like this hidden, Jamal?" she asked, her tone dripping with mock sincerity. "Is this really something we should be proud of? A letter to your father? What's it really say about you, huh?" Jamal could feel the heat rising in his face, his hands trembling. He had no idea how to respond, his mind racing as he searched for something, anything to say that would make this stop. But Mrs. Harrison wasn't done. She kept talking, her words sharp and cutting, her voice rising with each passing second. "You know, Jamal, there's something about you," she continued, as if this moment were some grand revelation, "something about the way you carry yourself. You think you're better than everyone else, don't you? Just because you got a letter from your dad, you think you're special?" She held the paper out in front of him like a taunt, as if daring him to say anything that would make it all go away. Jamal felt the weight of her words sink in. He wasn't special. He knew that. He wasn't anything more than a kid trying to make it through another day in a world that didn't seem to care about him. But this was beyond anything he had ever experienced. The humiliation, the way Mrs. Harrison had twisted something so personal into a weapon, it left him speechless. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He couldn't speak. His mind was numb, his body frozen in place as Mrs. Harrison towered over him, the box still dangling from her hand. "Do you want to explain yourself, Jamal?" she asked, her voice now quieter, but no less menacing. "Or should I just tell everyone what I think this is really about?" Jamal's mind was a storm of confusion. He had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable. He could hear the distant chatter from outside the classroom, the soft echo of footsteps in the hall, but it all felt so far away. There was nothing but him and Mrs. Harrison in that moment. And she was waiting for him to break. Jamal started, but the words caught in his throat. He couldn't finish. He couldn't say anything that would make this feel less like an attack, less like an accusation. His entire body felt heavy, the air thick with the oppressive weight of Mrs. Harrison's judgment. The silence stretched on, unbearable and suffocating. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Mrs. Harrison let out a sigh, a soft sound of disappointment. "You know, Jamal," she said, almost as if speaking to a child, "this could have been different. But I guess you just don't have it in you. Do you?" Her words stung, but there was something else behind them. Jamal could hear the subtle, almost imperceptible undertone of something deeper. A prejudice that wasn't just about a letter. It was about who he was, where he came from, and how she saw him. It was a look of disdain, a look that saw his struggles as weaknesses, his aspirations as irrelevant. She wasn't interested in hearing about his dreams or his pain. She only cared about what fit into her narrow view of the world. As the final bell rang, signaling the end of the school day, Jamal stood there, frozen, unable to move. The classroom door swung open, and the students began to flood out, their voices mixing with the sound of footsteps. He could hear Derek and Tasha's familiar chatter from the hallway, but it felt like a world away. Mrs. Harrison slowly placed the box back on her desk, her expression unreadable. "You're free to go, Jamal," she said coldly, her tone devoid of any empathy. "But remember, actions have consequences. And next time, think about what you bring to school." Jamal didn't say anything. He didn't know what to say. He didn't know what to feel. His whole body felt numb, as if he were walking through a fog, unable to see clearly. He grabbed his backpack and turned toward the door, his movements mechanical, like he was on autopilot. But just before he stepped out into the hallway, he heard Mrs. Harrison's voice one last time. "Don't let me catch you bringing anything like that again, Jamal," she warned, her voice low, like a threat. Jamal didn't respond. He couldn't. He just walked out, his mind spinning, his heart heavy with the weight of what had just happened. But as he stepped into the crowded hallway, the chaos of voices and footsteps rushing around him, something shifted inside him. He wasn't sure what it was yet, but he knew one thing. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The world outside the classroom had never felt more chaotic. Jamal could hear the hum of conversations, the clattering of lockers, the rush of students heading to their buses and cars. But to him, the sounds seemed distant, muffled by the pounding in his chest. He walked down the hallway in a daze, his backpack heavy on his shoulders, the weight of Mrs. Harrison's cruel words still pressing down on him. Each step felt like an eternity, the world around him spinning faster than he could keep up. He had to get out, get home. He had to see his mom to escape the suffocating walls of the school. His sneakers squeaked on the tile floor, their worn soles barely making a sound as he walked, his footsteps lost in the noise of the crowd. Derek had called out to him a few times as he passed, but Jamal couldn't bring himself to respond. He didn't know what to say, how to explain the mess that was unraveling inside him. His hands were shaking, his mind clouded with anger, humiliation, and confusion. He needed to get away, to clear his head. But there was no escape. Not really. Not from this. As he neared the exit, he saw Tasha leaning against the wall, her arms crossed, a frown etched on her face. She was waiting for him. Her sharp eyes followed his every move as he approached, and she didn't say a word, just watched him, like she was waiting for him to crack. "Hey," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You good?" Jamal stopped in his tracks. He could see the concern in her eyes, but he wasn't sure how to answer. Could he even explain what had happened? Could he make her understand the way Mrs. Harrison had belittled him? He shook his head, the anger bubbling inside him like a kettle about to explode. But he kept it down, kept it locked away, his jaw clenched so tightly that his teeth ached. "No, I'm not," he muttered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm not good, Tasha." She stepped forward, reaching out to place a hand on his arm. "What happened?" she asked, her voice soft but insistent. "Talk to me, Jamal." The words tumbled out before he could stop them, as if they had been waiting for just this moment to escape. "Mrs. Harrison, she humiliated me today, in front of everyone. She made fun of my shoes, but that's not even it. She saw my letter, the one I wrote to my dad. She mocked it. She called me weak. Jamal's voice cracked, and he felt the first wave of tears threatening to spill. He swallowed, hard, trying to push the feeling down, but it surged forward, unstoppable. "She made me feel like I don't belong," he continued, his voice barely a whisper. "Like I'm nothing. Like my family is nothing." Tasha's face softened with sympathy, but she didn't let go of his arm. She didn't say anything for a moment, just stood there with him, as if the weight of his words were too much to bear, for both of them. But when she finally spoke, her voice was fierce, determined. "Jamal," she said, her voice full of conviction, "you're not nothing. You're everything. And that teacher, she doesn't get to define who you are. You don't. Let her do that." Jamal shook his head, his eyes cast downward. "But she's got power, Tasha. She's the teacher." She can ruin my whole life with a word, with a look. I can't do anything about it. Tasha stepped in front of him, forcing him to look her in the eye. You can do something, she said, her words sharp and steady. You will do something. You're not alone in this. We're with you, Jamal, and we won't let her get away with this. Jamal's chest tightened. He wanted to believe her, wanted to feel the strength of her words coursing through him, but it felt like his entire world had just cracked open. Mrs. Harrison's words, her disdain, the way she had made him feel small and insignificant, he couldn't just brush that off. It wasn't something that could be fixed with a few kind words. It was a wound that went deeper than his shoes, deeper than his letter. It was a wound that cut into his very identity. Before he could respond, Derek appeared, his face creased with concern. What's going on, man? He asked, glancing between Jamal and Tasha. We've been looking for you. You good? Jamal opened his mouth, but the words were stuck in his throat. He couldn't explain. He couldn't find the right way to make them understand the hurt that had lodged itself inside him. The injustice that Mrs. Harrison had made him feel so small, so unworthy of respect. But Tasha spoke before he could say anything. He's not good, she said, her voice steady. Jamal just got humiliated by Mrs. Harrison. She's been coming at him all week, and today was the breaking point. Derek's eyes narrowed in anger. What the hell did she do? He demanded, his tone low and fierce. She mocked him, Tasha continued. Made fun of his shoes, his letter to his dad, and then tried to make him feel like he was less than everyone else, like he was nothing. Derek's fists clenched at his sides. That's messed up, he muttered, the anger in his voice palpable. She's way out of line. We can't just let her do that, man. We can't let her get away with it. Jamal looked up, his eyes meeting Derek's for the first time. The fire in his friend's eyes gave him a flicker of hope, a spark of something he hadn't felt all day. Maybe, just maybe, they could do something about it. Maybe he wasn't as powerless as he had thought. But as the words began to form on his lips, the sound of a familiar voice cut through the air, sharp and cold. Jamal. It was Mrs. Harrison. She was standing at the end of the hallway, her gaze locked onto him with an intensity that made his stomach drop. She had been watching from a distance, listening, waiting. What are you doing out here? She asked, her tone laced with authority. Shouldn't you be heading home? Or maybe you've got more important things to discuss with your friends. Jamal felt his body tense. He could feel the weight of her judgment pressing down on him once more, the way her gaze seemed to strip him bare, like she could see into his very soul. But this time, he didn't shrink away. He didn't cower. No, Mrs. Harrison, he said, his voice steady, his chin raised. I've got something I need to say. Tasha and Derek looked at him surprised, but they stayed silent, giving him the space he needed. Jamal took a deep breath, the words slowly coming together in his mind. You don't get to treat me like that, he said, his voice gaining strength with each syllable. You don't get to judge me based on what I wear or where I come from. I am who I am, and you don't get to make me feel less than that. I'm not afraid of you, Mrs. Harrison, and I'm not going to let you take that power away from me anymore. For a moment, Mrs. Harrison didn't say anything. Her expression flickered between surprise and something else, something darker. But Jamal didn't wait for her to respond. He turned to Derek and Tasha, his friends who had stood by him when no one else had. They were his support, his strength. We'll handle this, Jamal said, his voice full of resolve. Together. With that, he turned his back on Mrs. Harrison and walked away, his steps firm and confident. This battle wasn't over. It had just begun. The air outside was crisp, the golden light of late afternoon casting long shadows across the school courtyard. Jamal walked with purpose, his footsteps echoing in the quiet space as he made his way toward the small bench under the oak tree where Derek and Tasha were waiting. His backpack felt lighter now, not physically, but emotionally. There had been a shift, a turning point that he couldn't quite explain, but he knew it was there. Jamal, Tasha called out when she saw him. What happened back there? We didn't expect you to just walk away like that. That was powerful. Jamal smiled faintly, sitting down beside her, the cool breeze ruffling his hair. I just couldn't take it anymore. I couldn't let her keep pushing me around, keep making me feel like I'm nothing. I had to say something. I had to stand up. Derek nodded, clapping Jamal on the back. And you did, man. But we're not done yet. We can't just let her walk away from this, right? We need to make sure she faces what she did to you. And not just you. Everyone she's ever made feel small. Jamal's heart raced. Derek was right. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. But there was something different in his chest now, something that burned brighter than the shame and fear that had weighed him down earlier that day. Maybe, just maybe, this was the first step in reclaiming his power. I've been thinking about that, Jamal said, looking out at the horizon as the sun dipped lower in the sky. I can't let her get away with making me feel like that. Like, I don't matter, but I don't want to do it just for me. I want to do it for everyone she's done this to, everyone she's put down, everyone who's ever felt less than. Tasha's eyes glinted with determination. That's what I'm talking about, Jamal. We're not just fighting for you, we're fighting for all of us, and we're going to make sure everyone knows what she did. The three of them sat in quiet contemplation for a moment, the gravity of their words sinking in. But Jamal wasn't afraid anymore. He wasn't the scared kid who had walked out of that classroom. He was something stronger now. He had his voice, and with it, he had the power to change things. The next day, Jamal went to school with a new sense of purpose. The moment he stepped through the front door, he knew that today was going to be different. There was a fire inside, him that couldn't be ignored, and he was ready to take action. It didn't take long for word to spread about what had happened between him and Mrs. Harrison. By lunch, every corner of the school was buzzing with the story. Some students whispered about the way Mrs. Harrison had humiliated him, while others shared their own experiences of being treated unfairly or with prejudice. Jamal's act of defiance had sparked something in the school, a shift that couldn't be ignored. But it wasn't just the students who were talking. It was also the teachers. And that's when Jamal's moment of reckoning came. During his last class of the day, just before the final bell rang, Jamal's principal, Mrs. Clark, came into the room. She stood at the front of the class, her presence commanding the attention of every student in the room. Her eyes found Jamal, who sat at his desk with a mixture of apprehension and hope in his chest. Jamal, Mrs. Clark said, her voice calm but authoritative. I need you to come with me. Jamal's stomach churned. He had no idea what to expect. Was he in trouble? Was she going to reprimand him for speaking up against a teacher? His mind raced as he stood up and followed her out of the classroom, Derek and Tasha's worried glances following him as he left. Mrs. Clark led him down the hall, her heels clicking against the tiles. She stopped in front of her office and motioned for him to sit down. Jamal hesitated for a moment but then took the seat in front of her desk. He couldn't help but feel a knot tighten in his stomach. I'm sure you're wondering why I asked you to come here, Jamal, Mrs. Clark began, her tone steady and professional. We've received some concerning reports about your interaction with Mrs. Harrison. Jamal's heart skipped a beat. This was it. The moment he had been dreading. I didn't mean to cause trouble, he stammered. I had to stand up for myself, for what she said to me. It wasn't right. Mrs. Clark nodded slowly, her gaze never leaving his face. I understand, Jamal, and I want to assure you that we take situations like this very seriously. Disrespect, humiliation, and discrimination have no place in this school. No student should ever feel belittled or made to feel less than anyone else. Jamal's breath caught in his throat. He had expected a reprimand, but he wasn't prepared for this, an acknowledgement of his pain. For the first time in his life, someone in authority was validating his experience. I've spoken to Mrs. Harrison, Mrs. Clark continued, her voice firm. She's been made aware of your concerns, and she will be undergoing sensitivity training to ensure that no other student feels the way you did. I'm also encouraging her to have a one-on-one conversation with you to address the situation more directly. I hope you'll agree to that. Jamal blinked in disbelief. He had expected a vague apology or even a dismissal of his feelings, but this was something different. Something that felt like justice. I never thought this would happen, Jamal said, his voice a little shaky. I thought I was just going to get in trouble for speaking up. Mrs. Clark's expression softened. I'm glad you spoke up, Jamal. You had every right to. And I'm proud of you for finding your voice. You showed strength today. Not just for yourself, but for others who might have been too scared to speak out. Jamal didn't know what to say. The weight that had been on his shoulders for so long seemed to lift just a little. He wasn't alone in this fight. The school, even the administration, was standing behind him. As he walked out of Mrs. Clark's office, Jamal felt a strange sense of peace settling in. This wasn't the end of the battle, but it was a victory. He had been heard, and things were starting to change. Later that day, as the final bell rang and the students flooded out of the school, Jamal found himself standing in the same spot where he had first confronted Mrs. Harrison. But this time, it wasn't just him standing there. Derek and Tasha were beside him, their faces full of pride. You did it, man, Derek said, slapping him on the back. We all did. Jamal smiled. He felt a sense of pride he hadn't known in years. Yeah, we did. And it's just the beginning. Tasha grinned, her eyes sparkling with excitement. Together we can make sure that no one ever feels like they're less than. We're stronger than that. Stronger than her. Jamal nodded, his chest swelling with a new kind of strength. It wasn't just about standing up to Mrs. Harrison anymore. It was about standing up for all the students who had been overlooked, dismissed, or silenced. They were going to fight for equality, for respect, for the chance to be seen. And together, they would make sure no one would ever feel less than again. The journey wasn't over, but Jamal knew one thing for sure. The world was listening now, and they were ready to make it right. Jamal's story is not an isolated one. It is a powerful representation of the struggles faced by many individuals in a society plagued by systemic racism, prejudice, and discrimination. His encounter with Mrs. Harrison, though personal, is part of a larger narrative that plays out in schools, workplaces, and communities across the globe. At its core, the story speaks to the enduring impact of biased attitudes, microaggressions, and institutional power imbalances on marginalized groups, particularly Black people, who continue to fight for their dignity, respect, and equality, in a world that too often marginalizes them. Jamal's experience reflects how these biases are not always overt or malicious, but insidious and deeply ingrained. Mrs. Harrison's actions, from mocking his shoes to belittling his personal connection to his father, reveal the harmful ways in which racial prejudices and stereotypes manifest in everyday interactions. Her behavior may have seemed small or insignificant to some, but to Jamal it was an attack on his identity, a denial of his worth, and a reminder that he was seen as other simply because of his race. It is these subtle yet devastating acts of discrimination, whether in the form of microaggressions or overt bias, that compound over time and contribute to a system of inequality. Jamal's confrontation with Mrs. Harrison and his subsequent resolve to stand up for himself are symbolic of the larger fight against systemic racism that has plagued Black communities for centuries. While overt segregation may no longer be legal in many places, the legacy of racism still lingers in institutions, policies, and societal structures. Schools, which are supposed to be places of learning, growth, and empowerment, can often become sites of exclusion, alienation, and injustice for Black students. The educational system is one of the most powerful institutions in society, yet it frequently fails to address the needs of Black students or combat the biases embedded within its structures. For instance, studies have shown that Black students are disproportionately disciplined, suspended, and excluded from educational opportunities. In the classroom, they are often subjected to lower expectations, harsher scrutiny, and fewer opportunities for academic success. Jamal's experience of being belittled for his shoes and the content of his letter is a clear example of how Black students can be marginalized in subtle yet harmful ways. Teachers, who are expected to foster an inclusive and supportive environment, sometimes fail to recognize or acknowledge their own biases. This not only undermines the educational experience for Black students, but can also have lasting psychological effects. A study published by the American Psychological Association found that exposure to racial discrimination, even in subtle forms, can lead to lower academic achievement, lower self-esteem, and mental health challenges for Black youth. Moreover, Jamal's experience of being dismissed and invalidated by Mrs. Harrison also mirrors the historical dismissal of Black voices and experiences. Throughout history, Black people have been silenced, ignored, or outright rejected by societal institutions, whether it be in the form of unjust laws, discriminatory policies, or simply the everyday biases that permeate interactions. Mrs. Harrison's mockery of Jamal's shoes and letter exemplifies how these seemingly small actions accumulate, leading to feelings of invisibility and self-doubt. When these microaggressions are perpetuated by those in positions of authority, such as teachers or school administrators, it sends a message that Black students' voices, experiences, and identities are not valued. One of the most significant aspects of Jamal's journey is the role of his friends Tasha and Derek, who supported him throughout the conflict. Tasha's insistence on standing up for him, Derek's anger at the injustice, and their collective determination to fight for justice demonstrate the importance of solidarity and allyship in combating racial discrimination. Jamal could have chosen to navigate the situation alone, but by leaning on his friends and accepting their support, he was able to find strength and empowerment. In the fight against racism, it is essential to recognize the power of allies, individuals, who are not directly impacted by the discrimination, but choose to stand up and advocate for change. Historically, allies have played a crucial role in movements for racial justice, whether it was white abolitionists working alongside Black activists to end slavery, or non-Black people fighting for civil rights during the 1960s. In Jamal's case, Tasha and Derek serve as modern-day allies, using their voices and influence to challenge Mrs. Harrison's behavior and advocate for a more inclusive environment for all students. Allies in the fight against racism must not only listen to the experiences of marginalized communities, but also be willing to confront their own biases, educate themselves about systemic inequality, and use their privilege to challenge oppressive systems. In schools, this means teachers and administrators must actively work to create an environment where all students, particularly Black students, feel valued and supported. This can be achieved through cultural competency training, anti-racist education, and implementing policies that promote inclusivity and equity. While Jamal's personal story concludes with a sense of justice, his confrontation with Mrs. Harrison and her eventual acknowledgement of her wrongdoing, his story also serves as a reminder that individual instances of racism are symptomatic of a larger, more pervasive issue. The fight against racism cannot be won through isolated incidents of defiance or small acts of resistance. It requires systemic change. To address the systemic nature of racial inequality, it is important to look at the root causes of these issues and take comprehensive action. Educational institutions must not only focus on individual incidents of discrimination, but also assess the broader structures that allow such behavior to thrive. This includes anti-racist curriculum. Schools must prioritize teaching about the history of racism, its ongoing impact, and the contributions of marginalized communities. By incorporating diverse perspectives into the curriculum, students can learn to recognize their own biases and challenge the stereotypes and prejudices that perpetuate racial discrimination. Cultural competency training. Teachers, administrators, and staff should undergo regular training to better understand the cultural experiences of their students and the biases that may influence their interactions. This training can help educators identify subtle forms of racism, address harmful stereotypes, and create a more inclusive learning environment. Inclusive policies. Schools must implement policies that specifically address the needs of marginalized students, particularly Black students. This includes ensuring that students of color are not disproportionately disciplined or excluded from advanced academic opportunities, and that they have access to the same resources and support systems as their peers. Student advocacy. Students, like Jamal, Tasha, and Derek, are not only victims of the system, they are also agents of change. It is crucial to empower students to speak out against injustice, whether through student organizations, peer mentorship programs, or by creating safe spaces for dialogue. When students have the tools to advocate for themselves and others, they become a powerful force for positive change. Community involvement. The fight against racism is not limited to the classroom. It requires a collective effort from families, community organizations, local governments, and other stakeholders. Schools should collaborate with these groups to create a supportive network for students and ensure that they are given the tools they need to succeed. Looking forward, Jamal's story offers a glimmer of hope in a world still grappling with issues of racial inequality. While his personal victory over Mrs. Harrison is an important step, the larger work of dismantling systemic racism continues. This work requires courage, perseverance, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. It demands that each of us, whether we are educators, students, parents, or community members, take responsibility for creating a world where every individual, regardless of their race, can thrive. As we reflect on Jamal's journey, we are reminded of the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who once said, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere."